All right, so welcome. You should have thought of some questions to ask our panelists and have written some down. If you haven't, please make sure that you do that. This is for you, so we want to make sure that it's worthwhile to you. Okay. So now I'm going to let our awesome professors introduce themselves.
I'm Valeria Bertacco. I'm a professor in computer science and engineering. I have lots of practice in very large classes because that's all we get in that department. I've been a professor in Michigan since 2003, and I do research in designing hardware systems, silicon chips.
My name is Noel Perkins. I'm faculty in mechanical engineering, and I teach a spectrum of classes ranging from specialized graduate courses with maybe the enrollment of 20 to large undergraduate courses where the enrollment might be 120, often at the sophomore level, and what I'm currently teaching. I've been at Michigan for an embarrassingly long period of time, 30 years now. And I'm a big fan of active learning methods in the classroom, including large classrooms.
Branko Kirkes. I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering. I've been here for 4 years, 2013, so a little bit over 4 years. Teach like the spectrum, like 200 level, 400 level courses. So I'm teaching one this semester on probability and statistics, which we were just talking about, and it's required. And a lot of them don't know why they have to take it or why they have to remember calculus. So that one is like particularly challenging, but also really, really fun. And then grad classes on the kind of stuff I do research on. So I do a lot of stuff on like smart infrastructure, smart cities. That's basically what I work on. So. And I've gone to these seminars. Like when I first got here, I went to as many as I could. So just like you guys. In fact, I think, paneling. I'm not in a panel. I was sitting on the other side, which is kind of interesting now.
So for those of you who remember, what would you wish you would have known before you started teaching? If you could think of a couple of things that you wish you would have known before you started teaching.
Okay, so first of all, I never taught as a graduate student. My first teaching experience was as a professor. Okay. Actually, I did teach one lecture one time when I decided to become a professor just because I wanted to take a look if I liked it. And I taught a 90-minute class in 40 minutes. In hindsight, I have no idea if anybody understood anything. And then I came here and they gave me a class, and I actually loved it because I didn't know anybody in this town, and that was my only opportunity during the week where I could talk and people would listen. So it was fantastic. What did I wish I knew? I had no idea what I could expect. I had no idea how to convey a decision in a way that the student wouldn't argue. So for instance, during my first semester, there was this one student who I was teaching a 598, so a 500 level class. It was 3 credits. This one student takes a class. He got an A-. Somehow he needed to get to a certain GPA, and he calculated that if my class counted for 4 credits, the GPA would have been reached. So after the end of the class, he started coming to my office. He wanted me to sign that he would drop the 3 credit class and take the 4 credit class. And I said, no, everybody took it for 3 credits. He started following me around. He would wait out of the classroom during the following semester. It got to the point where he would follow me to the bathroom. So eventually, he threatened that he would go and talk to the department chair, which he did, and I never seen the student again. And that resolved the problem. But now, I would probably be much more determined when I convey my decisions, so nobody would think about following me to the bathroom. Yeah.
When I taught my first class, I remember teaching it the way that I had been taught, which involved a lot of talking and very little dialogue. And I wish that I had listened to my conscience that said, you know, this isn't working so well for the majority of my students. The majority of my students might learn differently, and particularly given an opportunity to be practicing in class what we're discussing and asking questions more than just listening to a talking head. So, you know, I taught the way that I had been accustomed to being in the classroom. And so I wish I had the courage back then to deviate and follow what I thought would be a better course. And I didn't at first.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of hard to think about how things could have been differently. I'm kind of glad things went the way they did because you learn along the way. I guess the biggest thing for me, granted I started 4 years ago, so I got into class, I was very close in age to most of the people in class, and I had this idea that everybody's like smarter than me and they would figure out all these loopholes when I'm teaching and stuff. And I guess I just would have wished I would have just calmed down, you know. I had a couple of epiphanies along the way, like within the first month, where I was like, it's okay, just calm down, everything's gonna be okay, and then it just became okay. So it was good. And I think specifically to what you're addressing about, I came in delivering content as opposed to just like being like, because that's what I was used to. Go copy some notes, and if you bring some notes, they can copy to class. You've somehow done your job as a teacher, right? But you can get those notes on the internet. So, like figuring out how to make that transition from content delivery to actually like engaging with the class and getting a pulse on every one of them, and seeing that across the last 4 years they all move at their own different pace. That was kind of the big thing. And I don't know how I would have done that by knowing that earlier. I think it's just something you sort of learn as you go along. So,
How do you know that your students are not getting it?
Well, you poll them frequently. So there are a couple things that I use in class. So in a setting of 100 students, I don't have the patience to work with clickers because I think they take a fair bit of time. But I'm good with just saying, give me a show of hands. Do you get 90% of this or above? I don't expect 100%, but a quick show of hands. And I might use that, 5 to 10 times in a given session just to get a measure of where they are. And if I don't see the hands shoot up immediately that I expect, I don't march ahead. I'll turn around and think, okay, well, I'll do something a little bit differently. Let's try it this way instead. So it's not scientific, but it seems, to me, it gives me a sense that I understand their pulse.
I use the same exact technique because I got it from you when you were at a panel. I remember you mentioned that, like, I actually did it this morning. I was like, I presented something where I could just tell it's Monday and they're going to have some exams later this week and they're just like kind of slow. And I was like, who gets 50%? And then everybody raises, who gets 60%? You can sort of see the hands dropping, and that gives you kind of like a histogram of how it works all the time. And that's because you mentioned it. So thanks.
Sorry.
It works. It works really well.
Do you also have to read their faces? Because some people might raise their hand if they feel embarrassed.
Yeah. Or also there may be people that, particularly those sitting maybe in the front of the class where they are being observed by their classmates, they're a lot less likely to raise their hands. They don't want to divulge, I know or I don't know. So you have to be very sensitive and watch faces, watch for body language, and pay attention to the people in the back because they have nothing to lose there, right? Nobody's looking at them. And there are a lot of truth tellers back there. So I don't always believe the hands that I see up either.
So I do different things. First of all, I think you can see it on their faces when they're lost. So that's a sign there. But there are two types of faces I can detect. I don't understand what's going on, and oh gosh, I'm so tired. So I actually, in some classes, especially when I'm teaching at 9 o'clock, and I know it shouldn't be like that, but if I teach 9 o'clock on Monday, I tend to be coffee. That helps having actually higher attendance, and they get more engaged. Coffee and sugar. The other thing I do is, throughout my lecture, I always have class problems. And I don't necessarily tell them the answer after I give them a few minutes to work on the problem. I ask them to work in pairs, and then I don't give them the answer. So if I don't give them the answer, they want to make sure they have that answer, and I give them the opportunity to ask questions, but they get more engaged. Because if you give them the answer, they may think, okay, I didn't get this. I'll figure it out this afternoon when I look at her answer. But if you don't, that's the only time where we can sort things out, and they tend to come out. I also walk around the classroom while they work, so I can check on them, I can talk to them, I can get a sampler of what's going on.
Excellent. So let's open it up to everybody, but we're going to start with sort of like the order in which things happen. So if you have questions about preparation before you get to class, let's start with some of those. For example, you already talked about what do you do when you're nervous, and how do you calm yourself down? Are you not nervous anymore when you go to classes because you're used to it, or are you still a little nervous when you come in?
I think that's kind of gone away. I think it was just that initial thing. I think the first day of the semester is always unique too, because you get a brand new batch of them, especially if it's a class of like 100 or so. But like, I think at least I've found a way to just breathe and relax, and that's gone. That went away relatively quickly, you know. But yeah, I mean, I think for me preparation is really big. So I only give myself a certain amount of time too, because you could spend 10 hours for 1 hour of lecture if you give yourself that much time. So I kind of just sabotage myself and give myself only 2. And then that way I have to force it in there. And then the thing I do stuff like I like to write on the board a lot just because that slows down the class. And I actually draw out the board on paper for every given classroom I'm in. And then I know exactly how to copy from board to board. So I have my layout. Like this semester I have the board split up into 3 parts. And then I write on those. And as I'm moving along, it doesn't make me like frazzled to look for a marker or whatever. I just know how things are moving and stuff like that. So I have my boards, I color code, and I just follow that every given semester. And that also sort of forces me to rewrite the notes every time before. And just that habit helps me.
So I have the opposite problem. If I know exactly what I'm going to say, I'm going to speak way too fast. And so I make a point to have an idea of my slides, but not really know them. And that helps me slow down my pace. I also I would never plan the whiteboards, otherwise I would, cover them way too fast and then the students. So I purposely put little stops my lecture.
So reflecting on the issue of fighting nerves. So I think nerves, if you don't have them, something's wrong. I think you should all be nervous. I remember being tremendously nervous the first class I taught. And so what helps counteract that is that the preparation work that you do. If you feel through the preparation work you're now more secure in what you're going to say and how you're going to present it, that definitely helps defeat those nerves. And do the nerves ever go away? Yeah, they eventually do, but I think on very different time scales. We're all really different. So, maybe after 1 year someone doesn't have nerves. I think I had nerves for a good 10, 15 years. And I think that, so how do you counteract that? It's just exposure to it and realizing it's all part of the process. And again, just being secure in what you know in your preparation. That said, so what brings out the most nerves in us? We are afraid of exposing something about ourselves for something we don't know, for example, in front of a large audience, right? So that can be frightening. And you can also think of different strategies for how to defeat that. So a student asks a question, you don't know the answer, okay? I think a good way to handle that now, and I'm not so sure that I handled it well when I started, is just to acknowledge, hey, I don't know the answer to your question. That's a great question. But give me a chance. I'm going to go home tonight and I'm going to look at that. And maybe I can respond at the next class meeting, or I can send a message to you or post it on our course website, and I'll address it later. I don't have to do it real time. But if I'm forthcoming and saying, I don't know the answer to your question, but I'll think about it. People read that. That's a really earnest response, and people, will relate to that.
Excellent.
And they like it because you go and you look it up for them, and it was like they prompted you to do something that you might have not done otherwise. So I think they actually really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So when I was in grad school, I took a class in signal processing, which was not a requirement. It was not in my main field, but the instructor was the most famous good instructor in the university. So I wanted to take that class. And one day he comes to class and he said, the concept I taught you last week, it was all wrong. I'm sorry. And he basically spent half an hour re-explaining it, and what he did the prior week was completely wrong. Okay? So whenever I'm there thinking, what if I teach them wrong and then they catch me? I was thinking, if I'm wrong, I greatly appreciated that. Nobody figured out that he taught us wrong. But he still came through and, clean up and explain the whole thing better, and was awesome. So
Great.
I think owning up to it's kind of important, right? Because you don't want to teach them the wrong thing, right? I started doing this thing 2 years ago. It's kind of silly, but it works really well in most of the classes.
when I was copying stuff on the board, occasionally I'd make a mistake when I was writing. And then there'd be hesitancy of them to ask me stuff. But after a while, like I noticed like once or twice, like, hey, is that a mistake? And I'm like, so I made a deal with them that for every mistake they catch on the board when I do it, I give them 1 point on the next test. And which is kind of funny because if they really knew about probability and statistics, which I'm teaching them, then the curve is just those, they wouldn't, it's just the average anyway. But they figure that out towards the end. But all of the semester they sorted it out sooner. Last year they're like, oh, doesn't that just mean that everybody's grade just changes? And I was like, okay, you got it. But the level of engagement is just wild because now they're just like incentivized to ask questions. And it got to the point where like, is that a mistake? It's like, no, that's not a mistake. I need like a bunch of vultures. But like it creates like a level of comfort that just like open the floodgates to other questions. And I'll do it any given semester if the mistakes get to that point. And just, it's been fine. It's not that bad. Like 5 points here and there just won't make a difference. So.
Okay.
Silly. It's like a trick. It's not really anything pedagogical, I don't think.
I like it. So I like to go back now to something that you were talking about how you can spend 10 hours preparing for a 1 hour lecture and how you have to bind that. So how do you know when to stop? How do you know that you have enough for it? How do you know, especially if you use active learning, how long things are going to take in the classroom? How do you plan? What to cover?
I don't start working on the lecture until after 5 p.m. the day before. That's what binds it. Yep.
Yeah, I think when I first started preparing for my classes, I would also prepare the evening before. And a serious amount of preparation, probably not anything like 10 hours, but several hours of preparation. And I think that was necessary for me to counteract the nerves that I felt at the time to become secure in what I was going to say. And that worked to start with. However, teaching that same class, the next year and the next year and the next year, that time diminished, and it diminishes very, very quickly to the point where eventually, at least for me, I just want an outline. What am I going to talk about today? And just have an outline of topics to put on the board. And so there's no right or wrong or one way of doing it. So it scales to whatever you feel you need, particularly the first time you do it. You're going to spend a lot of time. And think of it as an investment. If you are pursuing a career that involves routine teaching and you're going to be teaching this class over and over, yeah, the first time you're going to invest a lot of time.
Yeah.
Can I add something? Mm-hmm. I think the best preparation or the best investment in preparation is not the one you do before the given lecture, but is the one you do when you're planning the entire class. So for instance, I do this thing where I meet every student the first week of classes. That's something that requires me to block a number of hours during that first week. I need to plan ahead for it. Or a couple of years ago, I started doing these ICE exercises where I give them a link to a Google form that they work on during the class. So you cannot start that on lecture number 5. You need to plan ahead before the semester starts, or you don't deploy that. What you do before the lecture is make sure you know the material on your slides or your lecture note or whatever you have. But the shape and the form and the type of interaction you have in the class is something that you plan the month before classes start. Right? And I think that's the one that has the most impact, more than if you have a wrong Greek letter in some slide at some point during lecture X.
Yes.
This kind of goes along with that. When you're designing a class, how much buffer time do you put in for, say, when the whole class doesn't get a subject, so maybe you have to, or you teach it wrong, so the next week you have to teach it correctly?
That shouldn't happen every semester,
Oh, yeah.
by the way.
Do you put in buffer time? Do you plan out like
Yes.
every lecture for the whole semester?
I have 3 buffer times a semester. Basically, there is a lecture I dedicate before every exam to review. And that's really maybe a half a lecture, so it can be buffered if we're running late or something happened, or it can be more class problems if nothing bad happened.
I think I use much the same. For me, I walk in now with just an outline of what I want to cover. And then I have a set of examples that I would like to be able to offer that day. the number of which I get to is completely determined by the pace of that class. So when I start my class, I point to my agenda. I call it my agenda. My agenda for today is to cover these following topics. And then I pause, I say, that's my agenda, and I got plenty of time to get to it. What topics would you like me to add to the agenda today? Is there something you'd like me to review from last time? Or is there something that was bothering you from the homework that you'd like me to go over? So I think I have a fair bit of buffer every day because I'm trying to engage them right at the very beginning and have them shape the agenda. Now I'll tell you, I don't get a lot of takers. People don't at the very beginning of class say, oh, would you please go back and do that again? But the few times that it does happen, it's really important because I think that the topics that they have that are still lingering in their head, God, I didn't understand that. It's time to address it. And when somebody offers that, that's probably quite indicative of the way a lot of the students feel. So I'll make sure that I can do that. So what gets sacrificed is if I had 3 examples planned for that, maybe I only get to 2 or 1. I'm totally fine with that because to me, the number of examples I do is not nearly as important as sort of how well I do them. And what I mean by that is how much opportunity I give them to engage and try it. So if we have 1 slow example where they are doing all the steps, that's totally worth it. I'm happy to sacrifice the other 2.
Yeah, I think examples are definitely a good one to have handy because you can use it. There's also this other buffer of like, there'll be days where for whatever reason something goes wrong at home or whatever, you're just not ready for the lecture. You show up and you're like, I don't, this happened to me my first semester when I taught, it's like, I just don't have the content. You can always pull up your research slides and be like, let's talk about my research, because that's always a backup, right? Like you can have that for that lecture. And
I also have a, should you go to grad school?
Yeah.
I have my own presentation on that, ready to go.
Those always work because it's like, takes the pressure off of them to have to like, freak out that day and take notes on something or whatever. I mean, for me it was like, when I first started, I was always worried that am I going to have enough? And I should have realized that whenever you're worried about that, you probably have too much already. Because especially if you're going at the pace of a class, the challenge for me is actually figuring out how to, for all the classes that I've taught, every semester I seem to cover a little bit less. But to me, that's a good sign that they're actually, I'm trying to break in through to them and they're asking me more questions and stuff. So sometimes like I get to the end of the lecture and I have like 5 minutes left. And there's this inclination to be like, oh, let me just start the new topic, get it going, maximize my time. And I think that's been the hardest thing for me to be like, stop. Like stop.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop and I'm going to look at them and I'll prompt them to ask me a question. So I won't say, do you have questions? Because otherwise they'll just sit there sometimes. We just actually say, ask me a question, which is another thing I got out of these. Like, and then I count to like 3, 4 Mississippi in my head, which is like, you got to give them, because it seems like eternity, right? Like you're saying, like you can go really fast and you think, your notion of time is, I think, very different than somebody else's notion of time in the classroom. So whatever seems like an eternity to use to them, just another click on their phone or whatever they happen to be doing that day. And so I count for Mississippi, and if there aren't any questions, they're guaranteed to be questions as soon as some people leave. So if I have 5 minutes left, that's already like 4 minutes that are remaining now, then there's going to be an onslaught of them, 4 or 5 of them asking me something that they didn't want to ask for the class. So somehow time gets filled. And so it's actually, for me, it's been trying to figure out how to pace that. So I set a goal for each lecture. I say, this is what I want them to, this is another thing I got out of CLT seminars. There's content that has to get covered, but like, what is it that you want to be able to do at the end? So if you're able to finish that example problem and you feel like they do it, then you don't need to use those 3 minutes. Or you can use them to make an announcement, or you can do something like that. But starting a new topic is, they're already ready to leave. And I'm usually pretty happy if you let them out 2 minutes early for some reason. So
I don't know if you have that, but some of the classes I teach are double or triple offering. There are 2 or 3 sections. And the way we organize them is I would teach half of the semester, all section, or a third of the semester, all 3. So I start at 9, then I teach again at 10:30, and then at noon, crossing around campus, right? And you need to keep every section in sync because there may be another professor teaching the next week or something. And so that gets a little bit more challenging because they have to be perfectly in sync at the end of every lecture. So if in lecture 1 they say, can you explain the thing from last week? Lecture 2, I'm going to start saying, they just asked me to explain that thing from, and then they get it again, right? And the problem is if you get the question in lecture 3, And you're like, now what do I do? So you still covered the example from last week, but then you have to make up timing. It gets a little bit more challenging to keep everybody on the same page.
So what are some strategies that you can do in that situation?
I have jokes built in, so I can cut down on the jokes if I have to cover something from last week in lecture 3 that I haven't done in 1 and 2. And by the way, which do you think is the best offering if you have to do 3 back-to-back? My best show is always the second one. By the third show, I don't remember what I told them already, if it was a prior section or this. It's always the second one. The first one is tuned up, and the second is perfect, and third, some cracks start happening. But so yeah, you have to do whatever it takes to end up exactly in the same spot at every lecture. So maybe if there are always this class problem, I can give them a minute less, try to play a little bit with those boundaries.
Is there anything that you ever do by online in Canvas, delivering some material that way, or some practice that way, or maybe a handout or something along those lines? If that's the situation, you have to cover this much, and it took a little longer in the class.
No. I don't have them learn the material on their own because they woke up late and came to their own lecture. I have every lecture with enough space so that I could cover more if I needed to.
Okay.
But no.
Here's an instance where I might do that. Maybe a question was raised in class and I did not know the answer to it, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, again, hey, thanks for the question. I'll get back to you and I'll post that on Canvas. Or maybe I'm looking at the clock and I'm going, I'm not going to be able to get through my agenda right now because somebody introduced a topic at the beginning of class and set me back, 20 minutes from when I thought I would start. So what I'll decide on the spot is, okay, I'm going to give you the result that you need to know, and I normally would have given you a derivation of this result. But instead of that, I'm going to now write up the derivation, post it on Canvas, and it's your responsibility to understand that. And so, but in the end, I'm back on schedule. Now we're talking about the result and maybe an example to go with it. But I've decided to jettison something out of the lecture that I could then post. And that happens once in a blue moon, but I'll do that sometimes.
And like, for instance, if there is a question that sets you back 20 minutes, maybe instead I would say, how about I address that next week? So I can put everybody on that question, right? And I give them maybe a hint, but I don't go in detail on that one. So I don't get with the delay of 20 minutes. And part of the problem of this system is that students count on the fact that you stay in sync. So one time they show up at 9, one time they show up at noon. They keep moving around from lecture to lecture. So they expect that. They expect to get the same show consistently.
That's challenging.
Every section, yeah.
Okay, how about audience ask other questions about, it could be preparation for class. Anybody has a question about preparation for class that we haven't covered?
This was kind of related. I'm not sure. Let me know. I'm Angelica, by the way.
Hi.
And over the course of the semester, I expect that things like you can plan for one thing, but by the end, things change. So my question for you all is, how do you account for changes in the middle of the semester? For example, maybe something just isn't landing right with this group of students for whatever reason. How do you change things? How do you adapt? How are you flexible when it comes to your course material and content?
So, So I think students really want to know when there is lecture, if you have to cancel any lecture, when are the exams. You cannot change those things after the end of the semester. If you modify the content, and especially if you explain why, say, okay, we are going to modify the syllabus and cover these other things or cover more of that and less of others because I see there is a demand in the class. They are completely acceptable of that, amenable to that. So I actually would update a new syllabus, which would have some changes. I hope I don't change it drastically, and explain why and let them know that we did that and why we did that.
So I think the point there is that divulge your thinking, saying, hey, we're halfway through the term, and on our current pace, we're not going to be able to do everything on this syllabus that I thought we were going to get to. So now we have to prioritize. So looking at the things in front of us, I think that these 7 topics are the ones we should invest time in, and we're not going to talk about these other 3. But and if you were signed up for the class because of those other three, let me know. Come see me in office hours. Maybe I could provide you a mini lecture on that. But I think the idea is that just be open about the fact that we do have to change, and explain the reason why, use your best judgment, and then divulge that. I think everybody buys into that. By contrast, if you don't, and you suddenly try to speed up, or you suddenly eliminate topics that maybe were important to a few people in your audience, you might be getting some pushback and some resistance there. So it's always better to just be candid and share your thinking.
Can I ask something really practical? Let's say you go to class with 40 slides. Something happened, you have to explain something else, they don't understand, you cover 20, right? Don't just click through and then they wonder, do I need to know the material or not? What I would do is go and upload the slides again with only what we covered. So it's clear, this is what we did, this is what you're supposed to know. I don't have these secret slides that nobody really knows if we are meant to be known, but I didn't speak about it and all this, right? So keep a clear communication path.
And for those of you that are not using slides, not using PowerPoint.
Same with the notes.
Absolutely. So I don't use PowerPoint at all. For research presentations, I love it, but for teaching, I don't. And so what I can do is, on the fly, if I feel like I need to change something midstream in a lecture, I don't have slides that have constrained or divulged my planning. I just use the marker board. And now I'm going to go in this direction instead. So
I feel like I'm constantly modifying the syllabus for each class. Like, not that much. A class stays what the class is because that's what the content is, but pace tends to vary. You cover a little bit less. If you told them there's going to be less on a final or in a test, which is what a large undergrad class at the end of the day might care about, it's like they like you for it. The only thing you got to think about is, like, maybe I've never had this problem where I have to teach multiple sections, right? So there's a logistical thing there where you have to keep everybody in sync. Also, with some of our stuff, we have like these ABET accredited exams. So there's like certain topics they really have to know because there's a standard exam. So you kind of might want to prioritize those if you really feel like they're going to be tested on it somewhere else. But beyond that, it's like, the analogy I always tell them is like, it's like whatever somebody tells you in yoga, like, this is your class, right? So we're going to stretch as far as you're comfortable, right? I'm going to push you because that's what I'm here to do. But like, at the end of the day, if I just cover a bunch of stuff because I feel like that needs to be in there, or because I have 5 minutes left in lecture, I'm a little cynical sometimes. I feel like, what do I remember from undergrad? Do I remember that last 2 weeks that I learned in mechanics of materials or something like that? I don't. I remember like the fundamentals of that class. So that extra thing there that you might have lost might not be detrimental unless you do need it for something. So if there's a course that depends on it, you got to be careful of that, or if there's like an exam later. But beyond that, some classes do a little bit more, some do a little bit less. And I think that's okay as long as I feel like they're kind of getting it, which, again, I don't know how you evaluate that. You have to have a feeling for that, I guess, or metrics.
Thanks. Any other questions about preparing or planning? Yes.
Not exactly on the same track, but so I teach discussion sections for one of the classes in CS, and a lot of times what happens is you end up, talking about a topic which is a little hard to understand for the students, and you only have a fixed amount of time. You only have 1 hour with you, and then what happens usually with discussions, and the class that I teach is a big class. So what happens is we have 9 discussion sections, and each week, different set of people show up to your discussion. So you cannot carry forward one topic to the next discussion. And if it happens so that the topic that you're trying to teach is really difficult, then you might end up spending the whole hour, or even the whole hour is not good enough for that one particular topic. So what do? Do you say that, okay, this is it, we expect some sort of so how I tried to tackle that situation when it occurred to me was, I made it clear before starting the topic that this is something which is difficult and would require you to go back and do some reading on this again. And I do not expect this to be clear in the first go in the discussion itself. So please feel free to come back to me or send a note to me If it, after the post discussion meeting, if it is still unclear, please feel free to send a note to me. Is there a better way to sort of tackle this situation, or to sort of ensure that it is clear in the class to the students, or how do we tackle such a situation?
It's interesting. I would first ask myself the question, which is, why is it that this topic is so hard for my students to understand? And look at it from their perspective, not yours, because you're the expert, so it's no longer hard, right? But maybe you transport yourself back to when you were a student and you were learning it and it was hard. And why was it hard?
Mm-hmm.
And try to defeat the problem from the beginning by, if you can understand why it is apparently hard for a large number of students, try to pinpoint what is about it that makes it so difficult. And maybe before you get to that topic, you can address the root problem.
Yeah.
Here's an example. So I may have a problem or a topic in my class that relies on something from calculus that they don't understand well and they hadn't seen for 2 years. Well, maybe I should set aside some time and say, hey, before we talk about how to solve this ordinary differential equation in the context of a vibration problem, let me refresh your memory about what an ODE is and some of the common methods of solving it. And remember these terms in this language. Let's do something like that first. So if what you're trying is historically difficult, and it's always difficult and always difficult, I would encourage you to try to figure out what makes it so difficult and try to resolve that. Right?
Yeah, I mean, so the kind of problem that I'm particularly talking about requires some students to go back and actually write the code and fiddle around with the code and change a statement here and there and see what changes in the final output. Right? So it requires for them to sort of sit down with their laptop and spend some time with the same piece of code, but changing one parameter here and there and stuff like that.
So they have to explore and iterate.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that is what I advise them, that okay, you need to, so here's the code, this is what it is doing, but to understand these small nuances in the code, you need to sit down and go back and sit down and play around with this code, spend some time with this code. But yeah, it is clearly visible that for the first time when you teach it, to put it forward to them as a concept, it does not strike a bulb. It does not light a bulb. So yeah.
So maybe you could say, so here's what I mean by playing around or trying things out. If this is a concept you're having difficulty with and it's embedded in this code, let me divulge to you how I would figure it out. And I pull up my laptop, I say, here's the code, here's what I mean by playing around and doing it. And if I make changing these parameters, the output changes in the way that's what I expect. So maybe it would work if you actually gave them a quick demo of what you mean by that. Because I'm playing the role of, I'm in the mindset of your student now, you're telling me just go play with it. And I'm going, what does that mean? I don't play with it. I'm not sure I understand that yet. And so if you showed me what you meant, maybe I would get it and the light bulbs would come on. Just a thought.
You sometimes have to hand it to them, right? Because if we had an ideal world, everybody would be reading outside of class and they'd be going, experimenting, and spending all the time in the world in that class. But there's still an opportunity for them to get it. You just need to take them there, which means you might have to do the extra work or do the extra work of figuring out what they're struggling with, so you can go back and usually I find if one of them is struggling with a concept, it's just so many more of them, and there's just one of them was brave enough to ask you, and then sending them off and telling them to read something, it'll work for some people, but that'll work for only a few people, right? So I try to allocate some time where I just I'll just stop the lecture train and I'll take one lecture and just go, I don't think you guys are getting this. And unless they can convince me that they get it, I'm not going to go on. And then I repeat it and I bring out the colored markers and we do it. And then, it takes an extra 10 or 20 minutes, but I think is worth it. Because they'll come back and actually tell you like, oh, I think I get it now. And it's like, you then realize that if you wouldn't have done that, they wouldn't have done that extra work of doing it. And like, you know, that's just sometimes the reality of it. Like they're busy, right? And being aware of that and being just understanding of it, that they can't go solve their own problems. It's okay. You know, that's why you're here to help them. So.
I would like to add 3 quick things that came to mind by listening to them. First, it's always very good if at the beginning of your lecture or discussion you have a slide or 2 of what did we do last time, what did we do last week, what happened in lecture during the past week. Because these students are going from class to class and they have to context switch and remember, wait, what was the subject on this one? What do we go? So that helps a lot and may even make them remember that they left class the last lecture with a question they didn't get to ask. So I think that goes a long way to get everybody on the same page. In terms of asking questions, if you ask a question to the class and you don't wait for somebody to answer, they're going to learn that and they're never going to answer. But you need to have the patience until somebody starts answering. Then they understand that that's a communication protocol and they will answer faster. But if you start answering your question yourself, you lost them. Okay. And then the third thing, I forgot it. Yeah, I'll tell you later.
Well,
It'll
come back. Whenever it comes back, you're free to interrupt. Any other questions about preparation and planning or related to what we're talking about? Yes.
What are the strategies you guys use to make students enthusiastic in the subject? And like, what? Because it happened to me when I was an undergrad. If I liked the way, for example, the instructor taught the class, I would like I'm very enthusiastic in the class and did a good job in it. But the vice versa things happened too. So if I didn't like the class, I lost interest in the subject. So what do you guys do to make students eager?
Lead by example.
Yeah, so I think convey your own enthusiasm and interest, right? Make sure that what you're talking about is relevant by demonstrating that it is relevant. So you might begin a class like reviewing what you did last time, saying, remember, we were reviewing this material, and this material is so important because it can be used for these sorts of things. Or another thing I like to do is, I happen to talk about how things move, right? So I go, I did this today, give me an example of something that can be modeled as a rigid body that rotates about a fixed axis. And, and I get examples popping up all over, 5 hands come up. Okay, so it comes down to this. If you can motivate why it's important to cover the topic you're about to cover, if you can provide that motivation may come from your experiences or may come from the dialogue you have with your students and their experiences. The more often you talk about the motivation for why you need to learn what you're about to learn, the more often you're going to get the buy-in that you're looking for. They're going to find it interesting and engaging. Oh, now I understand. Now I understand why I need to learn how to solve a second-order ordinary differential equation. Because it's a model for this mechanical system that's vibrating. And I'm interested in that system. So provide the motivation.
I mean, you're kind of the salesperson for the subject, right? And so if you buy into it, hopefully they will too. So I mean, I actually just do little things like I just say like, oh, I think this is really fascinating. What about you guys? And usually they're like, not this. So I think if you're sort of personally excited about it, they're gonna get into it. But I think the context is so important. Of like, they're engineers, right? Otherwise they'd be in math or something like that, maybe, right? So they want to have an understanding of why it is that I need to do this. And it's like with this semester with probability and statistics, it's like they could easily say, well, is this just another math class? Because it could be. Here's an integral, here's a summation, I got to remember geometric series, why do I have to know them? Hey, here's a problem where it's used, and we're going to solve something with it. So during class, I try to pull, and it's a lot of work to come up with good examples that are going to get excited about, because it's so much easier not to come up with an example. Because you could just be like, here's a thing, solve it, get an answer, and they kind of get that in calculus, right? But if they got in calculus what an integral actually does and how it's useful, wow, And so if you provide them with that, that's oftentimes, I think, sufficient. And then just if you seem excited, they'll be excited. So I'm just going to maintain that all semester and be really hyped up. So
I remember.
You remember?
Yeah,
Go for
so
it.
it was something that Branko said about the student asking a question. So in general, especially in large classes, people are scared to ask a question in front of everybody else. And so there are 3 things I do to help with that. First, at the beginning of the semester, I tell them that any question is welcome. There is no stupid question, and everybody has to treat everybody else with respect. So the class cannot laugh if somebody asks a question, or the class will be in trouble. Then, when people ask questions, I always acknowledge a question. Even if they try to give an answer to a question I ask and maybe it's completely off, I say almost. I don't say wrong. You got the question wrong. So you treat them in a way that is welcoming. And I also go to the point where I ask questions to students and I have specific people answering, but I don't just pick them at random because they will stop coming to class if I do that. So what I do is I go by row, so you know when your question is coming. And you can prepare, or you can just change seat if it's a drastic thing. And then when question gets more difficult, I say I accept 2 people saying pass, but the third has to give me an answer. So I try to lower that barrier, but I still try to ask the right question and get them. It helps keeping them engaged, and it helps keep the class interactive, right? So I ask questions.
Interesting.
I have a question. My question was actually related to what you just said.
Yes.
So a personal example, whenever I was in one of my grad classes here, the professor asked for, the question was, what do you think is the most expensive part of a vehicle? And people were throwing out things like the body itself, the engine, the tires, and I said, the paint. And like 50% of the class laughed at my answer. And I was throwing it out there and putting myself out there, and it made me feel simultaneously angry and embarrassed. And then the professor was like, "You're right." And then because I was like emotional about it, I was like, "Ha!" And you all laughed at me.
You said that?
Yes, I did. And the one person even turned around and was like, "Oh, I'm sorry." I was like, "Thank you." But how do you deal with that? Like, how do you make sure that people don't make fun of someone's question or their response to a question or something like that? Because if I hadn't been right, like if I had been wrong,
Right.
I might not have ever talked in the class again.
Right.
Because I felt like, oh, I'm the stupid person here, but I ended up being right, so I felt really good about myself. But yeah, like how would you handle that?
So you do prevention in the sense that you tell them way at the beginning of the semester what's okay and what's not okay. 2, let's say you gave the wrong answer and everybody laughed. I would say something like, why are you guys laughing? What's funny about this? Like make them feel bad for laughing, slightly, and probably tell you right even if you were wrong, just to make them feel like it wasn't good to laugh, really push it. Or almost right. I would say maybe almost right, Yeah.
Yeah, it happens fairly often in my class where I ask them to ask me a question, and they'll ask a question, and it might be off topic,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll see some eyes roll. Okay, so kids in the front, they're going, oh. Okay, so I'll take that question, which, okay, it's off topic, but I can weave a story beginning with that question and bring it back on topic, and I just have to connect the dots. So I'll say, thank you for that. That was a great question. And I'm not sure that everybody else understands the connection yet, but here is the connection. And I'll map out the connection between what was asked to where maybe the majority of the class thought it ought to be. And so I think it does a couple of things. It helps the student feel, hey, I had an influence on the discussion and a positive influence. And for those in the front that rolled their eyes, it's a strong signal to them, this was a great question that was started off as kind of a tangent, but it's actually brought to a different perspective that's really important, and here's why.
But it also reinforces that every question is okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it does require that you think on your feet. And, this is where, remember what I said before, I would not have had the confidence to do this when I first started teaching, okay? But, fast forward 30 years and it's a lot easier. So acknowledge the question and show that it's relevant, because it always will be. There's something about it that was asked from their perspective that was relevant to them. You just have to figure out what that was and show it to the rest of the class.
Yeah, I think just encouraging it, because you get these like, I was trying to be on the lookout for the students that are borderline. They're like asking that question and they're already retracting it as they're asking it. They're like, I'm so sorry, this is a stupid question. It's like, then you just roll out the red carpet. Like, even if it's wrong, you swing it. You got to think quickly. You're like, okay, how do I make this relevant? Because this is definitely like, I have no idea how this relates to class, but I'll figure it out, right? Because it's wrong. It's like, it's a thing that was, maybe it wasn't well understood or whatever, but then you say like, I think this is what you're asking, and usually they'll just agree with you because, and then I thank them. I'm like, thank you very much for asking this question, because I bet there's other people who wonder something similar. And that gets those borderline cases to flip, because then they're more likely to ask questions. And then there's always the students who just know everything and just asking stuff to validate it or whatever. But like, and I think empowering that one person gets the next one to go around. But those are little things you'll figure out on your own as you're going along, like how to work those mechanisms.
Yeah,
So this is the opposite of that problem, and when you have one student who's just dominating the class, you will not stop.
Couple ideas quickly, okay? They want to be acknowledged, okay? That's why they're doing it, okay? And for some reason, they're hungry to be acknowledged every 5 minutes, okay? So I have a favorite thing I do. I look at them and say, I know you know. Great. Okay, I'd like somebody else to participate here, okay? And what does it do to them? They go, yeah, I scored, okay. That's great, okay. But it also, everybody else who's rolling their eyes, oh, that guy again? Okay, it listens to them, because now I'm going to turn it over and say, would you please, or somebody from this half of the class, give me a response instead, okay? So maybe that will work, or maybe there are other strategies that would work.
Do you know the people who always ask a question, which is the super advanced question about your topic? They clearly read the news and knew the last incident, and you might not even know about the last incident. Okay, those people, I just say, let's discuss after class. I need to stay on topic for a second. and if you're not a genius and you cannot really figure out to connect very off-topic question to the topic of the class, I think the most important part is acknowledging, thanking, not putting them on the spot, not making feel bad about asking the question. You can also say, oh, let me think. I mean, you don't have to be incredibly good at connecting dots on the spot, but you still can do a good service to those people who are asking questions.
There's sometimes a point too, I guess it gets to, sometimes there's questions that just drag out forever. Where they just like not letting go. What about this? What about that? And at some point you got to kind of decide to like, when have I sufficiently addressed this? Or can I keep circling around here with the hope that finally everybody's going to understand? Or you just sort of say, I'll get back to you. And then you address, usually what I do is I just stop those. If it goes on for a couple of minutes, I'm like, all right, this is clearly something you're wondering about. So what I'm going to do is I'll either write it up or I'll do a little like video thing online or whatever. And then, or I'll say, that's a good question. I might turn it into a homework problem. And that cuts it off.
It's a good question, but how about we discuss at office hours so I can still go through the topic of today?
Yeah.
Excellent. So other questions about managing students, things in the classroom. Yes.
I did want to ask about active learning. I think that puts a lot of responsibility on the student. So I was just wondering, what do you ask the students to complete beforehand just to make sure active learning is successful when they are in the classroom?
We may have different strategies because there are lots of strategies that fall under that bucket of active learning. So in my case, they don't have to prepare at all for the class. When I use the term active learning, to me, what I'm doing is I have deliberate pauses in the lecture where I'm asking the students to explain, for example, a concept to their neighbor and convince their neighbor that they know the concept, or maybe start on a problem, an example that we're going to be covering, and maybe then share that with their neighbor and show their neighbor that they know how to get started. So that's what I mean. So it doesn't require any preparation in advance. It requires the buffer time in the class where those activities are going to be used.
I also usually don't require preparation ahead of time, but my main goal in active learning is that people tend to come to class flip open their laptop and check Facebook, right? And I'm trying to keep them focused on the class so when they leave, they've learned something. And so I create these problems that are about every 10, 15 minutes, which are practice problems, and I force them to work in pair. People don't like to work in pair either. I'm faster alone or something, or they don't want to share with their neighbors or whatever, right? So I make them submit the answer online, and they have to provide the name of both partners. So they have to find a partner. And if they find a partner, you know, while if I'm alone and you give me a question, I'm like, whatever, let me play my video game here. I don't want to do this. But if I have a partner, then I have a kind of a responsibility to that person. So I'm tending to at least put it down a couple of minutes, work with him until we get it done, we submit, and then we go back, right? So try to create that type of dynamic. I like to videotape the classes so people who don't understand something can go back and watch them. That tends to let people stay home because they can watch it later. So I have this Google form I give them the link at the beginning of class, I shut it down at the end of class. So in a sense, you lose those points, which are epsilon in the global scheme of things. They probably don't change any grade, but you encourage them to come to class.
Did that address your questions?
Somewhat. I think because I help teach a project class, and so there's a lot more strategic thinking that we would like them to do. So I think I'm just trying to figure out how to encourage them to think strategically without babysitting them so much. So that's what I was wondering, kind of what iterations of active learning you use in your classroom.
Yeah, so I don't teach a project class, so it's more like a physics-based class or a science-based class. But let me speculate. If I had a project-based class, maybe I want to have an example or an activity that's active learning today that's going to require them to think strategically about their project. Maybe I need to diagram the session before what I mean by strategically thinking. The strategy for designing this thing should involve the following types of thinking. Before the next session, would you please map out at least 2 of these and be willing to share that with a neighbor as you come in? So maybe, I don't know if this is too simplistic, but maybe you just convey a class ahead of time what you expect for the next class so that they come prepared for that.
Okay, yeah, that's a helpful suggestion. Thank you.
I've been, I guess, broadly with active learning. I made the shift after going to some of these CRLT things. I was like, I got to, because I didn't come from that kind of background. Like, all my classes were always like, here's a bunch of stuff, copy it. Here's an example, copy the example. And it's like, I just copied it. And then I go home and I'm like, what was this about, actually? So just the general thing was to just accept that if I do an example in class that's going to involve them working on it, it's okay if I lose some other content. You know? Those 2 weeks at the end, I don't know what I would have taught, advanced materials or something like that, but letting go of it, being just okay with that. And then building the examples in a way where I usually try to convince them it's not always true, but I say, look, you could work on this example right now. It's up to you, or you could take a break. But I promise you, if you do this, it's going to make it's going to help you solve the homework very quickly. And usually they're like, it kind of works. I don't know what to tell you, just kind of like, it kind of works. So giving them an incentive for why they should do it and reminding them every time, as opposed to saying like, you know, you can or can't do the example, it's up to you. Because I don't want to necessarily force it when I'm doing it. Because I'm always worried that, you know, I was never that kind of student. Like if somebody told me to do an example in class, like here, take 5 minutes and do it. If we would have had smartphones back then, I would have been all up on that phone. Right? And I just want to acknowledge that there are students like that. And I did okay on tests and stuff like that because I went home and I learned. But there are students who don't go home and they don't learn on their own. You've got to give it to them right in class, and they want to get their money's worth. And it's surprisingly a large number. I always thought that most people don't pay attention in class, but I was just wrong. That's just how I was. You know, I try to teach that person like I was. I was like, if I was the kind of person who was intentionally trying not to pay attention in class, what can I do to rattle them a little bit? And so just kind of works, and they get engaged. And you lose a little like lecture time, but I think that's okay, you know, because they're actually doing prompts. So.
There was another question here.
So my main question is basically the challenge that I personally had in teaching large classrooms, like 140 students. And like the attendance rate drops significantly, and also like how to make it available for everyone, not discouraging like weak students not to participate, and also not to discourage talented students not to participate, because like this is really when the size of the classroom grows, then the diversity also is, you know, like especially in first year's classes. So what suggestions do you have?
Well, one thing is, what struck me in you're describing it is that a large lecture means you're going to get a large drop off in enrollment. And I don't buy that.
Not enrollment, attendance.
Attendance, sorry, attendance. So I still don't buy that. I think what you have to ask yourself is, what's happening here where the students are electing not to attend any longer? Why, maybe from their perspective, is there less added value in going to that lecture than you perceive? So if you reflect on maybe their experience, and maybe you can pinpoint an item or two saying, yeah, they're not getting much out of this, and if they're not getting much out of it, why should they be attending? So try to write that, okay? So my perspective is add a lot of value, right? Make sure that you're doing something that they can't just find from the book or on the internet, but you're doing something in class that truly enables them to learn. And so they go, wow, I learned a ton today in your class. I'm motivated to come next time. So it's hard to, I guess if it's got to the point where the students are not attending, you have to do a self-examination of figuring out why they're not attending and try to do something different. I agree that if the attendance is diminishing, yeah, you're losing a lot of the diversity of thought that you wish you had in the class. And you may be preaching to the choir that religiously attend because they feel a hyper sense of responsibility to attend because that's what they do. Okay. But I'd go back and I would want to find out why they're not attending in the first place. Maybe that means turning to CRLT and asking, hey, could you come to my class and look at what I'm doing and give me some feedback on, from your perspective, you know, what's going well, what could I improve on, why are my students not interested in coming? In fact, they can actually poll your students and pretty much ask that question.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that at the end. It's called a midterm student feedback if you haven't heard of it.
Yeah, so I think
I
it does.
would like
It
to add
certainly
something.
happens, but
It may not be entirely his fault. Like as the semester unrolls, students get more and more projects, their time gets more and more constrained, and they may think, oh, I'll catch that later at home. I can study that, right? And maybe that can be completely inaccurate. They may completely be fooling themselves about being able to get it, but this project is due tomorrow, we'll work on his class the day after, right? So there is also that type of reasoning that he has to counter.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for that too.
This is a really interesting question because I think it gets at the heart of something really fundamental, like modern day instruction. What is the value proposition?
Yeah.
Have you guys ever seen the Gilbert Strang linear algebra lectures on YouTube? Like amazing, right? And let's say he followed like the same textbook that you were using here. Why wouldn't you just go watch his lecture online? Because he's like, you know, the god of like linear algebra teaching. I mean, the way he draws dashes on the board is like amazing, right? But like, if you now had to teach linear algebra, and you said you can go watch his lectures or come to my lecture, what are you going to do in that lecture? And the way I've been like, pushing myself on this, and it is engaging with like CRLT and trying to figure out what is the modern value proposition. I upload all my notes, all the solutions, all the stuff. It's there. And I tell them, don't come to lecture if you don't want to. There's a textbook. You can use whatever mechanism you use to learn. That's fine. And you know, we have these things, unfortunately, in exams or whatever that we have to have. And if you just want to show up for those, you can. But then I try to have this conversation with them. I say, like, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sure that you guys have a reason to come here. And I always have this discussion with them every semester. It's surprising how much feedback you'll get from students where you say, like, this is your class. So you tell me what you want, and we'll work together and make it work. And like you're saying, it doesn't drop off.
It's there. They don't need to come. And I always tell them too, like, they're like, oh, I missed lecture, or, you know, what if I don't show up next week? I'm like, I'll give you all my notes. Here you are. Like, if you really want them. If you think that's how you learn, then that's up to you. But hopefully there's something I'm doing here that makes you show up on any given day. And that's up to you to figure out. And you can kind of work with the class, because as you're saying, like, you'll figure out if that's working or not. And I think when it is, then it becomes really cool, because then something's happening. It's not just watching somebody. It's actually like doing something, right? And that's going to depend on the class, it's going to depend on you and the students, everything. So.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Somebody who has something that we have not talked about. Yes.
Well, so it actually touches a little bit on his question as well. So, but how do you strike the balance when you have such a diverse set of students in terms of those that just get everything and those that really struggle? How do you strike that balance, and how do you set up your lectures so that you strike that balance?
So there is a class I teach where we need to cover some material from a sophomore level class, because that is not a prerequisite, because people from different paths have to be able to take the class, right? So I have people in the class who know much more than what I'm covering on that specific topic, and people who never even heard it. And so what I do is I dedicate only one lecture to it, so I kind of strike the balance, as you say. I dedicate only one lecture, and I cover the material fairly quickly, so that the people who already know it put up with me. I warn them too. I said, some of you already know all this. Be nice, help your fellow students when we do the problems. And then the people who never seen it, I say, okay, online there are this extra slide, this extra chapter, I prepare it all for you. You will have to do some extra catch up here, because we cannot spend the whole semester on that. And you know, it's a one lecture, so they have to. If it was an entire semester, it would kill me. But
yeah, a couple of thoughts. So I will, as I mentioned before, I'll try to poll them frequently to figure out, are you getting it? And even as unscientific as it is, I get a good sense that when they are getting it and when they're not. I'm not looking for everybody to get it. That's an impossible goal, right? So if I ask, raise your hand if you get 90% of this or above, and I see only 7 hands go up at a class of 100, I know what I need to do, right? I'm not moving on. But the converse, if I see, 80% of the hands, 90% of the hands go up, maybe I'm comfortable enough saying, okay, well, in the interest of time, it's time to move on. So I'll make those judgment calls, on the way, but with some feedback. So I'm not just moving on because I feel like I need to move on to my next topic and the time is, becoming less.
Okay.
It's up to you too. Like, who do you want to push? Like, I don't know. I think it's a really hard question. You got to come to on your own a little bit too to decide. Like, I've had classes in college where like the professor was clearly teaching the top 3 people in the class. He just loved pushing them, and it's like it came to some extent to the detriment of other people who weren't moving along. This class wasn't the most important thing in their life, and you could argue, well, that was probably good because maybe those 3 people ended up in academia, something like that, and that maybe was the goal that that particular person had. But for me, it's always hard to see, like, I don't know, I need to have at least half the class get it. Otherwise, I can't go on. That's like my personal thing. One way to do it is if you do breakout examples, you can always have an easy part and a hard part. And as long as everybody gets the easy part, that's good. And if somebody solved the hard part, it's like, hey, good for you. Remember your name and we'll move on. So.
Great. So if I could ask as a final thought, do you, each one of you have word of encouragement or final short piece of advice that you could tell everyone here? We'll start with whoever's ready.
So I think if students feel you know them and you care about them, they'll give more in the class. So knowing their names, talking to them a few minutes after class, ask them how it's going when they show up super tired on a Monday morning. Just build a little bit of a relationship goes a long way, both in terms of showing up, but also in terms of working on the class topic. There is that connection that is very motivating for them.
I would say something along the lines of just strive to enjoy it. I mean, if you're going to do this as a career for decades, make sure you're having fun with it along the way. I mean, it's awesome. It's a blast. And if you can maintain that perspective and seek to enjoy it yourself, and you convey that to your students, and it keeps you going forever.
Yeah, I think I would say something similar. Just like relax and enjoy it. This is kind of a strange job. Like if you think about going into academia, teaching is part of it. It's not going to go away. And if you view it as something you have to do, like, oh, Mondays and Wednesdays I have to teach, you don't have to, because you could go into industry, you could go to a national lab, you could even come here and just do research if that's what you like. But if this is going to be part of what you do, if you're not enjoying it, it's a pretty substantial part. But the flip side is that if you are enjoying it, it's like, I don't know, for me it's like the break of the day, because it's kind of fun, you know? I don't know, you go out and talk to a bunch of people and hopefully they like you and you like them, and it's like, it's pretty cool. So I think if you just get frustrated, then it becomes annoying, because then you lose the connection and there, you know, just, I don't know, so just have fun with it.
Great. Well, let's thank our panel. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.